It was a warm summer evening, and the park was full of life. The sound of laughter filled the air as kids ran around, playing games. In one corner, a group of teenagers, including a girl named Mia, were hanging out with their friends. Mia was 16, a shy but strong girl who loved to spend time with her friends. They were sitting on the grass, enjoying the cool breeze, chatting about school and the upcoming summer vacation. The park was quiet at this time of night, and the group of friends had no idea that their night was about to take a shocking turn. They were laughing when they heard the sound of car tires crunching on the gravel path. Maya looked up and saw a police car pulling up close to them. She didn't think much of it at first. Police officers often drove through the park at night, keeping an eye on things. But this time, it was different. The officer who stepped out of the car was tall and broad-shouldered. His uniform was neat, but his face was full of seriousness. He had a scowl on his face as he walked over to the group of teens. His eyes scanned each of them, and they all felt a chill run down their spines. "Hey!" the officer barked. His voice was rough, and it made Maya's heart race. "What do you think you're doing here? It's late, and you're causing a disturbance. Are you all old enough to be drinking?" Mia's friends quickly looked down at the ground, avoiding eye contact with the officer. They knew what was coming. Maya felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't drink alcohol, and neither did any of her friends. They were just hanging out, having a good time. But it seemed like the officer wasn't in the mood for small talk. "We're just sitting here, officer," Maya said softly, trying to explain, but her voice trembled. The officer didn't listen. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I don't care. You're all breaking the rules by being here this late. What do you have in that bottle?" He pointed at a half-empty beer bottle that was lying on the ground next to one of Mia's friends. The bottle wasn't even hers, but Mia knew the officer wouldn't care. He was already angry, and they were about to pay for it. Before Maya could say anything, the officer grabbed the bottle and shoved it into her hands. "Drink it," he ordered. "If you're old enough to be out here, then you're old enough to drink." Mia froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't happening. She didn't want to drink. She didn't want to cause trouble. But the officer's eyes were hard, his hand tight around the bottle. He was serious, and he wasn't going to let this go. Maya looked at her friends, hoping one of them would speak up, but no one did. They were all too scared. The officer's voice grew louder. "Do it. Drink the beer, or I'll take you in." Mia could feel the heat of her face turning red. She didn't want to cause a scene, but she didn't want to drink either. She hesitated for a moment, the bottle still pressed against her lips. Then she did what she thought would make the officer stop. She took a small sip, trying not to choke. She hoped he'd be satisfied with that. But it wasn't enough. "Not good enough," the officer shouted. He grabbed the bottle and shoved it harder into her mouth. "I said drink it all." Mia's eyes widened. She couldn't believe this was happening. The officer was forcing her to drink alcohol. She tried to pull back, but his grip was firm. She was terrified, humiliated, and confused. What had she done to deserve this? She had always been taught to respect the police, but this officer was making her feel like she didn't matter. Her mind raced. She had to get out of this situation. But how? There was no way she could stand up to him, at least not like this. Mia's throat tightened as the officer kept pushing the bottle. She felt trapped, with no way to escape. Her friends were watching, their faces filled with fear, but no one moved to stop him. Maya didn't know what to do next. All she could think of was how she wished this nightmare would end. And just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, she realized something. The officer wasn't just an ordinary cop. He was someone who had the power to change everything. But right now, Mia had no idea who he was. All she could do was keep her head down, hoping that somehow someone would step in to help her. Mia could barely breathe as the officer held the beer bottle firmly against her lips. Her hands shook, and her heart pounded loudly in her chest. She never imagined she would be in this situation. The cool night air didn't feel cool anymore. It felt heavy, suffocating. The officer's face was stone cold. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her feel even smaller. He wasn't just a cop. He was someone who took pleasure in making others feel powerless. Mia tried to look away, but she couldn't. His glare pinned her in place like a bird caught in a trap. "Drink it," he commanded again, his voice harsh and loud. Maya felt a lump in her throat. She knew she couldn't fight back. If she didn't do what he said, it would only make things worse. But she couldn't help the tears that started to fill her eyes. She wasn't crying out of fear for herself. No, she was crying because she couldn't understand why this was happening. What had she done to deserve this kind of treatment? The officer was so close now that she could smell the cigarette smoke on his uniform. His breath was heavy, and his hands were rough. She flinched when he pressed the bottle harder against her mouth. "Come on," he growled. "I'm not asking for much. Just drink the damn thing." Mia felt like her world was falling apart. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but she knew it wouldn't do any good. He had all the power, and she was just a scared teenager. She looked at her friends, but they were all standing there, frozen. No one spoke up. No one dared to stop the officer. They were too scared. She could see the fear in their eyes. They all wanted to help her, but none of them had the courage. Mia's mind raced. She had no choice but to do what he said. She closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and slowly lifted the bottle to her lips. As the cold liquid touched her tongue, she felt her stomach turn. She didn't want to drink, but she didn't want to make things worse. She swallowed once, then twice. The officer was watching her closely, waiting for her to finish. But it wasn't enough. "Finish it," he demanded, his voice growing more forceful. Maya felt the tears spill down her cheeks. She was scared, but more than that, she was angry. This wasn't right. This wasn't how things should be. She tried to take another sip, but it felt like the bottle was choking her. She could feel the officer's hand holding it firmly, pushing it against her mouth as if she were a child who had to obey. "Are you scared?" The officer sneered. "You should be." Mia didn't know how to answer. She was scared, yes, but she wasn't scared of him in the way he thought. She wasn't scared of his uniform or his badge. She was scared of what he was doing to her. He wasn't protecting anyone. He was hurting her. As she stood there, feeling trapped and powerless, she tried to remind herself that this wasn't her fault. She hadn't done anything wrong. She didn't deserve this. But the officer didn't care. He was enjoying the control he had over her. "Pathetic," he muttered, shaking his head. "You're just like all the rest of them." Mia didn't understand what he meant. Who was he talking about? All the rest of them. She wanted to scream, to shout at him that she was different, that she wasn't like anyone else he had bullied. But her voice wouldn't come. Her chest felt tight, and her body was shaking. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer pulled the bottle away. Mia gasped for air, her head spinning. She had never felt so humiliated in her life. Her knees buckled, and she almost collapsed, but she caught herself. She didn't want to fall in front of him. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction. The officer stepped back, his cold eyes still on her. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" he said, his tone almost mocking. Mia didn't say anything. She couldn't. She wanted to leave, to run away from this nightmare, but she knew she couldn't. Not yet. Not while the officer was still standing there, watching her like a predator who had just made his move. As the officer turned to walk away, Maya felt a mix of emotions. She was angry. She was hurt. But most of all, she was terrified. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. This night was far from over. The officer had just turned to walk away when something unexpected happened. Maya stood there, trembling, trying to keep her emotions in check. Her hands were still shaking, and the taste of the beer lingered in her mouth, making her stomach churn. She wanted to leave, to get away from the nightmare she had just lived through, but she couldn't move. As the officer took a few steps away, Maya felt a rush of anger. She had been humiliated in front of her friends, forced to drink something she didn't want, treated like she didn't matter. It was wrong, and she knew it. But there was something else inside her, a feeling that told her she had to say something. She had to stand up for herself. Without thinking, she spoke. "You don't know who my father is," Maya said, her voice steady but filled with a mix of anger and fear. The officer paused. He didn't turn around, but he stopped walking. For a moment, the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Maya's friends looked at her, their faces filled with confusion and curiosity. They didn't know why she had said that, but they could see the determination in her eyes. The officer slowly turned back to face her, his eyebrows raised. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice quieter this time, but still with an edge. Mia took a deep breath. She was scared, but she knew she had to go through with it. "You don't know who my father is," she repeated, her voice a little stronger now. "He's someone important. Someone who doesn't take kindly to people like you treating his daughter like this." For a brief moment, the officer's face changed. His eyes widened, and his expression shifted from annoyance to something closer to fear. Mia could see the shift in him. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to fight back. "Who is your father?" the officer asked, his voice almost too quiet, like he was afraid to hear the answer. Mia's heart raced. She felt a knot in her stomach, but she didn't back down. "My father is Chief Gregory Steele," she said, her words clear and confident now. "He's the head of the police department, and you just made a big mistake." The officer's face went pale. He took a step back, his eyes darting around like he was looking for a way out. Mia could see that the mention of her father's name had caught him off guard. He had no idea that the girl he had just treated so cruelly was the daughter of one of the most powerful people in the city's police force. For a few seconds, the officer said nothing. He just stood there, staring at Mia with wide eyes, like he was trying to process what she had just told him. His earlier confidence, the way he had been in control of the situation, was gone. Now he looked like a man who was about to lose everything. "Wait," the officer stammered, trying to regain his composure. I didn't know you were." "Of course you didn't," Mia interrupted, her voice cold. "But now you do. And now you're going to regret what you did." The officer's mouth opened and closed, like he was searching for words, but nothing came out. He looked at her for a moment longer, then glanced at the group of Mia's friends, who were now looking at him with a mix of confusion and disbelief. Mia could feel her pulse racing, but something inside her told her she was in control now. She wasn't the scared girl who had been humiliated just moments ago. Now, she was the one with power. "You should leave," Maya said firmly, her voice gaining strength with every word. "And you should pray that my father doesn't find out about this." The officer stood there, staring at her for a moment longer, his eyes filled with fear and regret. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the ground. Maya watched him go, her heart still pounding in her chest, but she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corners of her lips. She had done it. She had stood up for herself. And in that moment, Maya realized something important. The officer had tried to break her, but instead, he had only made her stronger. As the officer disappeared into the distance, Mia let out a long breath, finally feeling like she could breathe again. Her friends rushed to her side, their eyes wide with shock and awe. They didn't know what to say. They had seen the fear in her eyes earlier, but now, they saw something else, something powerful. Mia had just taken control of her own story. Mia stood still as the officer disappeared into the distance, his footsteps growing quieter with each passing second. A sense of relief washed over her, but it was mixed with a wave of confusion. She had just told the officer that her father was Chief Gregory Steele, the head of the police department. But was that really true? Did he even know who her father was? Mia didn't have time to think about that for too long. Her friends crowded around her, their faces filled with shock and disbelief. They couldn't believe what had just happened. A few minutes ago, they had seen Mia terrified and helpless, forced to drink the beer under the officer's orders. Now she was standing tall, her back straight, as if she had won some kind of battle. "Did you really mean it?" one of her friends, Emma, asked. She was the most nervous of the group, always second-guessing everything. "Is your dad really the chief?" Mia took a deep breath. She wasn't sure why she had said it. Maybe it was the fear that pushed her to speak up. Maybe it was the anger that had built up inside her. Or maybe it was because, deep down, she knew her father's position held power. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She wasn't going to back down now. "Yes," Maya said, her voice steady. "My dad is Chief Gregory Steele." Her friends gasped, their eyes wide with disbelief. Emma took a step back, shaking her head in amazement. "I can't believe it," Emma said softly. "You never mentioned it before." Mia didn't respond. She wasn't sure why she had kept her father's job a secret. Maybe it was because she didn't want to seem different from everyone else. She had always tried to blend in, to live a normal life like her friends. But now, everything had changed. Her father's name had just made everything real. Maya turned and walked away from the group, heading towards the park's exit. Her mind was spinning. She had always known that her father held power in the city, but she had never really understood what that meant. He was strict, a man of few words, and he often seemed distant, always busy with his work. Maya loved him, of course, but she had never felt like he understood her. But now, after what had happened with the officer, Mia began to wonder if her father's power was something she could use too. Her friends followed her, their voices quiet as they tried to process everything. They couldn't stop talking about what had happened. It was like they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. "That officer really thought he could do whatever he wanted to you," said Jake, another friend. "But you showed him. You told him who your dad was. And he just walked away." Mia nodded, but the victory felt hollow. She hadn't wanted to get the officer into trouble. She had just wanted him to stop hurting her. But now she felt a strange sense of pride. She had stood up for herself. She had taken control of the situation. And that meant something. As they reached the park's exit, Maya stopped and turned to face her friends. "I don't know what will happen now," she said quietly, "but I'm not going to let anyone treat me like that again. Not ever." Her friends nodded in agreement. They were amazed by her strength. They knew Mia as the quiet, thoughtful girl who rarely spoke up, but now they saw her in a new light. She wasn't the same person who had been humiliated just hours ago. She was different now, stronger. Mia felt a surge of determination. She wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever happened next, she knew she had the strength to face it. As she walked home that night, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change. She had just revealed a secret she had kept hidden for years. Her father, Chief Gregory Steele, was a powerful man, and his name meant something. But Mia didn't know what kind of changes this would bring. She didn't know how her father would react when he found out what had happened. She had no idea if he would be angry or proud. But she did know one thing. She was no longer the scared girl who had stood in that park. She was someone different now. Someone who could stand up for herself, no matter what. The next day, Mia couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her stomach. She had gone to school like normal, but everything felt different. The students in her class whispered behind her back, their eyes always following her whenever she walked past. They all knew what had happened the night before. The officer, the beer bottle. And most of all, they knew what she had said about her father. It wasn't long before her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from her mom. "Your father wants to see you after school. Come home right away." Mia's heart skipped a beat. Her father rarely called her into his office. She had no idea what this meeting would be about, but she had a feeling it had something to do with the incident the night before. She had never told her father about what she had gone through at school or the things the officer had done to her. But now, it seemed like everything was about to come to light. When school finally ended, Mia walked home slowly, each step heavier than the last. She could already picture the look on her father's face when he heard what had happened. It wasn't anger she feared, but disappointment. He always expected Mia to handle everything on her own, to stay quiet and out of trouble. But this time, she had spoken up. This time, she had broken the rules. When Mia arrived home, her mom was waiting by the door. She gave Mia a concerned look but didn't say anything. Mia walked past her and headed straight for her father's office. Chief Gregory Steele was sitting behind his desk, his face hidden in the shadows. Mia could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second feeling like an eternity. She took a deep breath before knocking on the door. "Come in," her father's voice came, sharp and calm as always. Mia pushed open the door and stepped inside. Her father didn't look up from his paperwork, but she could feel the tension in the room. He was waiting for her to speak. "Sit down, Mia," he said quietly, motioning to the chair in front of his desk. Mia sat, her heart racing. She didn't know where to start. Should she tell him everything? Should she explain what had happened? Or should she try to protect him from the truth? She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing. She had to be honest. "Dad," Mia began, her voice shaky at first, but growing steadier with each word. "Something happened last night. A police officer. Her father's gaze finally lifted from the papers, his eyes cold and intense. He was listening now, his focus entirely on her. "What happened, Maya?" he asked, his tone still calm, but the edge in his voice was unmistakable. Mia took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her, but she pushed forward. "He shoved a beer bottle in my mouth and tried to force me to drink it. He said some really horrible things. And I told him who you were." There was a long silence. Her father's expression didn't change, but Mia could see his jaw tighten. He didn't speak for what felt like forever, and Mia could feel the tension rising between them. Finally, her father stood up and walked over to the window, his back to her. "You told him my name?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. Mia nodded. "Yes, I had to. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just let him keep doing that." Her father turned around, his face unreadable. "Mia," he began, his voice soft but firm. "You shouldn't have done that. You should have come to me first. You don't know what could have happened if he found out who I was." Mia felt a pang of disappointment. She had expected him to be proud of her, but instead, he sounded angry. She opened her mouth to speak, but her father raised his hand, silencing her. "I don't want you to use my position to get out of trouble, Mia," he said, his voice becoming more stern. "The world isn't as simple as that. You have to be careful." Mia's chest tightened. She had thought that revealing her father's name would make everything better, but it hadn't. Instead, it had made things more complicated. She didn't want to be careful. She didn't want to hide behind her father's name. She wanted to be treated like everyone else. "But Dad," Maya said, her voice cracking, "he was hurting me. And no one else was going to stop him. You always tell me to stand up for myself." "Well, I did. I stood up for myself, even if it wasn't the way you wanted." Her father stared at her for a long time, his eyes searching hers. Then, finally, he nodded. "I see." Mia didn't know what that meant, but she felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe her father didn't fully understand, but she had spoken her truth, and that was all that mattered. The next few days after Mia's confrontation with her father felt like a blur. School was tense, and the whispers from her classmates seemed to follow her wherever she went. No one said anything directly to her, but the looks they gave her told her everything. Everyone had heard about what happened with the officer. Some were impressed, while others seemed confused or even scared. But the thing that weighed most on Mia's mind wasn't the gossip or the strange stares, it was the officer. What would happen to him now? Would he be fired? Would he face consequences for what he had done to her? Mia knew he couldn't just get away with treating her like that. She had stood up for herself, but she didn't know if that was enough to bring about real change. Later that week, Maya was sitting at home when she saw a black car pull up outside her house. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. The car was sleek and expensive, and it looked out of place in the quiet neighborhood. Mia watched as the driver got out, straightening his jacket before walking to the door. A feeling of unease settled in her stomach. The visitor knocked firmly on the door. Her mom answered, and Mia could hear their conversation from where she sat. "Hello, Mrs. Steele," the man said. "I need to speak with Chief Gregory Steele." Mia stood up and walked toward the door, her curiosity getting the better of her. She peeked through the hallway, trying to catch a glimpse of the stranger. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp eyes. Something about him seemed familiar, but Mia couldn't place where she had seen him before. Her mom looked confused but stepped aside to let him in. The man walked into the living room, his expression serious. "I'm Officer David Carter," he introduced himself. "I work with the department, and I have something I need to discuss with Chief Steele." Mia felt her pulse quicken. She knew what this was about. This man was the officer who had humiliated her, the officer who had shoved the beer bottle in her mouth. He was here now, and Mia could only guess what he was planning to say. Was he going to try to apologize, or was he going to deny everything? Mia's mind raced as she quietly stepped into the living room. She didn't want to be seen just yet, but she had to know what was happening. She hid behind the doorway, listening intently. "Chief Steele isn't available right now," Mia's mom said, her voice unsure. "Can I take a message for him?" Officer Carter hesitated before speaking again. "It's about his daughter," he said, his voice low. "I need to speak with him directly. It's very important." Mia's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what he meant by important, but she had a bad feeling. She stepped back, unsure if she should reveal herself. But before she could decide, her father's voice echoed from the hallway. "I'm here," Chief Steele said, appearing in the doorway. He looked at Officer Carter with a sharp, serious gaze. "David," he added, nodding his head in greeting. "What's going on?" The officer looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Sir, I need to speak with you privately. It's about the incident with your daughter." Mia's heart started pounding in her chest. She stepped closer, making sure she wasn't seen, but just enough to hear every word. Chief Steele's eyes narrowed. "What about it?" The officer glanced around, then lowered his voice. "I made a mistake, sir. I acted out of line. I forced your daughter to drink the beer. I didn't think things through. And now I'm worried. People are starting to talk. Word is spreading, and I'm afraid this is going to cost me my job." Mia's stomach twisted in knots. She had expected the officer to come here to apologize, but she hadn't expected this. He wasn't just worried about what he had done to her. He was worried about himself. He was afraid of losing his job. I didn't know who she was," Officer Carter continued, his voice faltering. "When she told me who her father was, I froze. I know it was wrong, and I regret what happened. I was just following orders, but I shouldn't have treated her that way. I'm sorry, sir. I'm begging you. Please don't report this. Please don't let it go further." Mia's anger boiled inside her. This officer wasn't sorry for what he had done to her. He was only sorry for getting caught. He was worried about his career, his reputation. But Mia wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. From behind the door, Mia could see her father's face. His expression was hard to read. He stood still for a moment, considering the officer's words. "You'll have to wait for my decision," Chief Steele said coldly. "You've made a serious mistake. I'll need to think about what to do." Officer Carter nodded quickly, looking like a man who had just avoided a dangerous situation. He turned to leave but stopped in the doorway. "Thank you for hearing me out, sir," he said, before stepping out into the hallway and leaving the house. Mia watched him leave, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and anger. The officer was scared now. He wasn't in control anymore. And for the first time, Maya realized that her father's name held real power, but she also knew she would never let anyone treat her like that again. The days after Officer Carter's visit felt like a blur to Mia. She kept wondering what her father would do about the officer's actions. She didn't know if he would take the matter seriously, or if he would just brush it off. Mia had never seen her father act this way before. He was always in control, always calm. But now, he seemed distant, lost in his own thoughts. Mia's life at school was no easier. The rumors about what happened with the officer spread like wildfire. Some students were supportive, even saying Mia was brave to stand up for herself. But others were judgmental, whispering that she had caused unnecessary trouble. Maya felt the weight of their eyes on her every day. It was like she was under a spotlight, and the attention was both uncomfortable and overwhelming. But the real battle wasn't at school, it was at home. Every night, Maya would sit at the dinner table with her parents, trying to avoid eye contact with her father. She could sense that something was different. Her mother would ask how her day went, trying to keep things normal. But Mia knew it wasn't. She could feel the tension in the air, like everyone was walking on eggshells. One evening, a week after the officer had visited, Maya finally confronted her father. She couldn't take the silence anymore. She needed to know where things stood. "Dad," Maya started, her voice calm but firm. "What's going to happen with the officer?" Chief Steele didn't look up from his dinner. He didn't say anything for a long time, but Mia could see the way his jaw tightened. Finally, he put down his fork and turned to face her. "I haven't made my decision yet," he said quietly, "but I've spoken with the department. They're investigating what happened." Mia nodded, but a feeling of unease still hung in the air. "Is he going to lose his job?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Her father didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at her mother, who was watching them both closely. Then he looked back at Mia. "I don't know," he said slowly. "The department will handle it. But it's not just about the officer's job. It's about making sure something like this never happens again." Mia didn't say anything else. She wasn't sure if she was satisfied with his answer, but she didn't push further. She could tell that her father was trying to figure out how to handle the situation. The problem was, Mia wasn't sure if he understood just how much it had affected her. The next few days passed, and Mia tried her best to get back to a normal routine. She focused on her studies and spent time with her friends, though the weight of everything still lingered in the back of her mind. She knew it wasn't over. The officer had made a mistake, but the truth was, it wasn't just about him. It was about how she, as a person, was treated. It was about her right to be heard and respected. A week later, Maya received a letter in the mail. It was from the police department. She opened it with shaky hands, her heart pounding in her chest. The letter explained that Officer Carter had been placed on administrative leave while the investigation was ongoing. They were taking the matter seriously and would make sure to handle it appropriately. Mia wasn't sure how she felt about the outcome. She wasn't looking for revenge, but she did want the officer to face the consequences of his actions. She didn't want to let what happened slide. She had stood up for herself, and in the end, that was what mattered most. That evening, Mia's father came to her room. He stood in the doorway, his face softening when he saw her sitting on the bed, reading. "Mia," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I want you to know that I'm proud of you." Mia looked up, surprised. "Proud of me?" she asked. He nodded. "You showed strength, and you made sure that something wrong was brought to light. Not many people would have done that. You were brave." Mia felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. Her father hadn't just acknowledged her bravery. He had understood what it meant to her. It wasn't about using his name to get out of trouble. It was about standing up for herself, something she hadn't done before. "Thanks, Dad," Maya said quietly, a small smile forming on her face. "I didn't do it for the attention. I just didn't want anyone to treat me like that again." Her father nodded. "And that's why you're strong. You didn't let fear control you. I'll always have your back, Mia. Always." Mia smiled, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. She had faced her fear, stood up for herself, and come out stronger on the other side. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she could handle whatever came her way.